To be determined yet. We want to welcome everyone who's joining us online on this day. It is October the 23rd, 2022. We're glad that you are joining us and watching this video. We hope that God inspires you through the message, through His Word. We've just heard the reading of Scripture from the Message translation from Genesis chapter 1, kind of a pared down version. I like the Message translation because it's kind of a fresh way of approaching the Scriptures, written by Eugene Peterson, who was a professor, Presbyterian pastor, Hebrew scholar, Greek scholar, and so he wrote it as a kind of a refreshing way of looking at the Scriptures. I really appreciated that. Some years back, Connie and I and our kids used to love to watch the BBC series Planet Earth. Maybe some of you remember Planet Earth. You can still find it on many different channels. It was narrated by who? Richard Attenborough, wasn't it? Yeah. But it's close. I mean, one or the other brothers, they're all both good, eh? It's the pictures were stunning. The photography was amazing, and how they were able to capture, sea creatures or animals in the wild in breathtaking ways, or birds and so on and so forth. It really kind of opened you up to seeing the world in a new way, because many of us, of course, not being photographers and not having access to all the places where they went, haven't seen some of the amazing things that are around us in this fabulous world that God has created. I always think, when I see these amazing photos of these weird-looking creatures, of what an imagination God has in order to create a planet that will be able to sustain all of creation and all creatures and all living things. But as incredible as our planet is, we all know that the environment is showing signs of stress, and climate change has the potential to cause huge problems, not only for us, but of course for the entire human race. In the year 2000, the UN brought together a panel of leading economists and experts from various fields to identify what the most serious problems facing the planet were and how that would affect humanity. And the second greatest problem they identified was climate change. In 2022, if that group was brought back together, maybe they would say that's at the top of the list. I'm not quite sure. And even those of us who live in this part of the world, which is beautiful, and where we have so many good resources, and the climate actually is fairly good most of the year, we realize that the climate has changed. I think of the Great Flood in 2013 in Calgary, and how that devastated so much of not only the city, but into the First Nations reserves and other places. And even here in Oceanside, where we are in kind of like drought-like conditions, which I don't know that that's happened in a very, very long time. Not having any rain or moisture for over 2 months is beautiful in one sense, but we recognize that it's taken a toll on a lot of the shellfish, a lot of the trees, and probably other creatures in this part of the world. Now, from these things, we know that global warming is becoming a more serious problem and has this negative effect on all of creation. And even though you may think it's a political problem or something the government should be tackling, which of course most are, you may not think that it's something to be talked about in church. But the reality is, from a Christian perspective, this is a spiritual problem as well. And as followers of Jesus, we should be concerned about the planet and creation that God has gifted to us. And so today, as I continue this new series, Finding Hope in Uncertain Times, I want to talk about the environmental crisis from a Christian perspective and talk about God's desire for each of us to care for creation. Let me start with this question. Why do you think God created such a beautiful planet? Why do you think God created this planet? Or this universe, for that matter? Well, maybe you have your own ideas. Maybe it's because God is so incredibly creative, like a divine Michelangelo who just has to sculpt and paint and create what God dreams about. And maybe that's part of it. Or perhaps God created this world because God loves beauty so much. Or God, like a mathematician, loves the intricacies of, divine nature, which is actually quite mathematical and is incredible in terms of bringing all the elements together in order to create a planet that sustains life like we have here. But the Bible tells us that God created the heavens and the earth because it is God's nature to be generous. And God wanted to share creation and eternity with people, God's created beings. The book of Genesis tells us that creation starts by God speaking words which have power behind them and have the potential to produce physical forces, matter, energy, and all the things that produce life on this planet and continue to expand the universe beyond this. And with every other word spoken by God in those, the Bible in Genesis 1 is this story of 6 days of creation, but again, you can see that as metaphorical, you can see it as maybe taking much longer than 6 days. However you see it, the reality is it's about God speaking life into existence. And with every other word spoken by God, something new is created. Light, then water, and after that dry ground, followed by vegetation, plants, fruit trees, birds, fish, and wild animals, all in their order. And God endows all creation with the incredible potential to grow and to change. And then comes this famous passage. Then God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image. Make them reflecting our nature so they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves on the face of the earth." God makes people and puts them right in the middle of all the beauty and majesty of creation. And if you notice in the story of Genesis 1, and there's a succeeding story in Genesis 2, if you notice, everything is connected to everything else. It's not like something is disconnected from the act of creation, because everything has its place and there's an order to all of creation that God sees divinely and that we inherit because we are created in God's image. God creates the world, the universe, and then the environment, followed by creatures and people. And we all depend on all parts of creation. We are not independent from creation. We are created within the natural order that God has gifted us. And so we're connected deeply to everything around us. There's two words in the Lakota First Nations language, and I can't pronounce it very well, but the English translation is "all are related." And if you've ever been in First Nations groups, you recognize that they see the intricate relationship between creation, between the rivers and the fish and people and creatures on the land and forests. They see everything as interconnected in a way that oftentimes Christians haven't seen as much. And that phrase, "all are related," is regularly used in their prayers and in their speeches as a way of saying that what happens locally impacts creation around us. And I think we're coming to understand a little bit more that what we do individually and collectively as people has an impact, either positive or negative, on the creation around us. Now, going back to that story in Genesis, nowhere does it say that God's creation was perfect. Did you notice that? It doesn't say that it was perfect. It says that God looked at everything and it was good. It was not perfect in the sense that nothing would ever change. It wasn't a static creation. It was designed by God to change and to grow and adapt as conditions adapted and changed in the world and the physical environment that God created the world as part of. When God had finished creation, the scriptures tell us that God saw everything that was made and it was good. And the people are placed in, at that point it looks like the Garden of Eden, right? That's where God, it says in the scriptures, that's where humanity gets its kind of birth. And they are there to care for and to bring the earth to its full potential. The Hebrew word often translated in that passage, which you probably remember from Sunday school days, which was God, created and then gave the earth to human beings, saying, "Have dominion and subdue the earth." That's how we used to think of it. But in actual fact, when you go to the Hebrew words, avad and shamar are the Hebrew words that are used in Genesis chapter 2. And that translation is to cultivate and care for, not to have dominion and subdue, but to cultivate and care for. And the word shamar implies not only to care for, but to cherish and guard from harm. And we've kind of misinterpreted that, and certainly in our way of progress, oftentimes we thought that we wanted to subdue earth. We wanted to have dominion over those forces of nature, which of course we know ultimately we don't have a lot of power over nature. Nature has a great deal of power over us. So the command from God to humanity is to care for and to be responsible for the earth. Not to be like mini dictators doing whatever we like with this gift of the planet, but rather to be responsible and care for the planet so that earth might continue to reflect the beauty and majesty and sustainability of all that God has created. The problem, of course, is that the world is starting to show signs that the tenants aren't really taking care, at least not best care, of the gift of the world around us. And it's producing problems. Rob Bell, one of my favorite pastors, who's written a variety of books, writes this. He says, God has given us power and potential and ability. God has given this power to us so we will use it well. The choices of the first people, Adam and Eve, when they sinned, threw off the balance of everything. Everything. Weather, trees, ocean. The people can't be separated from their environment. When Adam and Eve lived in the garden, they did so in harmony with the limits that God had established there. Remember, they could enjoy everything in the garden except for what? Well, there was that one tree. And maybe it was a tree of the good, the knowledge of good and evil. Maybe, again, it was symbolic of what God was trying to teach them, that there are limits on what you can do as human beings. You are not mini gods. You're created in the image of God, but you are not mini gods. And so there are limits on what we are given to do. And God does that. They could enjoy everything in the garden except the fruit from that tree. And God warned them if they broke the limit represented by the fruit of that one tree, they would bring upon themselves a shorter lifespan and problems that in time they wouldn't even understand and couldn't imagine. And of course, that's what happened in the story of Genesis. And as a result of living beyond the limits set by God, death enters into the garden and paradise is lost. Alienation and pain become part of their story. Alienation from one another, remember, they start to have this fight, they start to argue. It looks like they've been married for 42 years or something like this. I had to get the attention of people. I can see people drifting off. They have this alienation or separation from God, right? They start to hide from God, and God goes looking for them. It's not that God couldn't find them, but they hide from God. They're alienated from God. And then they're alienated from creation. And the story repeats itself down through succeeding generations. Christian author Brian McLaren sees a parallel with the creation story and where we find ourselves today in regards with the environmental crisis. And so he writes in one of his great books, Everything Must Change, he says, so many of the problems for the environment stem from a culture of consumerism where more and more people want more and more goods, which takes its toll on the resources of our planet. Most of us don't like living within the limits that God has placed in our lives. And that's so true. At least it is for me. But just like in the Garden of Eden, there are consequences when more and more of us fail to live within those limits, the boundaries that God sets. And it's not just we who suffer, it's people all around the world, many creatures and the planet itself, and potentially future generations. And we all understand this, don't we? I mean, we've heard this for a very long time. You've probably heard it in sermons or certainly on the TV and through governments. Our responsibility, though, I think, which is quite evident in the scriptures, certainly in Genesis, is that God has us be responsible for the care of the planet around us. We need to be more aware of what we as individuals do that has a negative or positive impact on the environment. We have an obligation to live more sustainable lives. And as followers of Jesus, we need to take that responsibility seriously because it matters to God as well as the whole human race. St. Francis of Assisi. Many of you have heard his name. Maybe you saw the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, or read a little bit about him, or read some of the poems. He wasn't always a lover of animals and creation. Before he spoke of having a vision from Christ, he was actually an entitled son of a wealthy cloth merchant. But then the voice of Jesus spoke to him very clearly, and he said, God said, "Go, Francis, and repair my home." And he wasn't just talking about a little broken down church that had kind of been demolished or had suffered through the ages. He recognized that God wanted him to be much more aware of creation around. And that's how I don't know whether it's a myth or the true stories of how, he started to be the saint for all the animals and for the blessings of the animals and care for creation. You see, Francis realized that to be a follower of Jesus isn't simply this spiritual relationship between God and myself, but between God, other people, and creation all around us. This is our home, the planet that God has gifted to us, and the home for billions of other people and creatures, and it's our Christian responsibility to help care for creation. When Jesus was questioned by a religious scholar about what the greatest commandment of the law was, you probably remember what Jesus said. Jesus said, "Love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself." Now, loving our neighbors is not just about the person you see down the street, or at the mall, or in town, or at church. It's also those living in far-off places around the globe. We know that now because we're connected to so many people who live a globe away. We're all connected, and we see that so evident in many, many ways. Surely in our enlightened time, we are coming to understand that love for neighbor and love for self naturally leads to love for the earth. Brian McLaren says, if you love your neighbor as you love yourself, you want both them and you to be able to breathe. So you need to love clean, fresh air. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you want them and you want yourself to be able to drink clean water. So you need to love pure water in all its forms. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think he's right. In our Western world, where younger generations are often turning away from organized religion and the notion of a God who must be approached through a kind of a complex belief system, maybe the love for others and our planet offers a way to re-engage younger generations with the gospel message. Perhaps if Christians can reclaim the Genesis story of cherishing God's good creation for all life and all people, and Jesus' call to love our neighbors in the broad sense, which includes loving and taking care of the planet, maybe younger generations will be more open to listening to Jesus' message and want to become followers of Jesus. Now, let's admit it, in all of these scenarios and all of these big problems that I'm preaching on, there are no simple solutions. There just are no simple solutions. It is a very complex problem, global climate, terrorism, all the political stuff going on around us. I'm reading another book, and I was telling Connie, I'm going to preach on it. I don't know how I'm going to preach on it, but it's about 3 problems around populism, polarization, and post-truth, which is really, really causing major problems, political problems in many countries. And as I was reading it, I was getting very depressed. I'm thinking I'm supposed to be preaching on hope, but sometimes the preacher needs to also have a dose of reality and preach to myself about hope. So that's in future weeks. I kind of digress. There are no simple solutions to the problems that we're facing in our day and age. There never have been simple solutions. Even in Jesus' day, there weren't simple solutions to all the complex problems of his time. There aren't simple solutions. But God doesn't call us to just sit in our own little corners or in our little churches and moan and gripe about the world or the problems around us. God says, you can do something. You have power. You have energy. You have my spirit. And so therefore, you can do something about some of these things that seem to be global problems, but can be tackled in some ways at a local level. And so we have to do our part in small ways and large ways, individually, as families, collectively, as churches, to truly love our neighbor as ourselves and to think of these global problems and do what we can to maybe make some changes, including in the environment. When we moved to Calgary back in 2007, we moved to Douglasdale, and the house that we moved into hadn't really been cared for a long time, and it just had a bare backyard for the most part. Connie wanted me to plant a tree in the worst way in the backyard. You remember this, right, Pauline? Yeah, you remember this. Some of you who've heard this story before. For many years, I resisted, thinking that, first of all, it would get in the way of the view, right? You have got this lawn that just is laid out there, and it's so easy to mow. I didn't want to have to go around a tree. Don't look at Rick that way, please, Barb. I didn't want to have to whippersnipper around it. Like, there were any number of reasons why that tree shouldn't be planted there. But I was worn down by my wife after 6 years of wanting that silly tree. So in 2018, for her birthday, I got this sherbet cherry tree in the yard. And we were there, well, I think last year when we were with Terry. Schubert tree. I think that's what it's called. It's a beautiful tree right now. You might be wondering, why did you wait for all those years? Well, I told you a few of the reasons, but my love for Connie wore me down, and so I got the tree for her. That's it. That is really what it is. But it's also a statement of faith that God has created the world in beauty and majesty. An actual fact, if you look at the leaf of a Schubert, or whatever it's called, not a filbert tree. They have filbert trees, don't they? Schubert cherry tree. I mean, any leaf is a work of wonder. All those little veins going out and the pattern that is there, like, it is majestic if you actually just study a leaf. Connie loves to go into the woods and take pictures of leaves and crazy little things and so on. And I'm always bugging her, why are you doing that? And so she just loves taking pictures of these beautiful, intricate works of art that God has designed and created. It's wonderful. I know that what we can do for creation is sometimes you can plant a tree, you can plant a garden, you can care for a garden, you can do things in your own world that actually help to reduce waste or to create a better environment for other people around you. You can support projects like the Widow's Garden Project, you know, that some of us were supporting, or how others of you have worked on other projects locally and globally to bring water, fresh, clean water to villages. All of those things, small and large, make a difference to people. And they show that we are taking a responsibility that God gives us to care for the planet. When we do small and large things, we are saying, Jesus, we love our neighbors as ourselves. We want to do something to make the world a better place for other people and to make better for all your creation. Now, I know that things look bad regarding global warming, but I want you to find hope, because Christian hope, which I defined last Sunday as confidence in what God will do and can do. Christian hope is based on trusting in God's goodness and love for us and for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that extends to how we honor God in the environment around us. Are we doing our part to cherish and care for creation? My friends, hope can arise as we align our lives and values and beliefs to the call of God we hear in Genesis to care for creation, and the call of Jesus to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, which by necessity means we have to love the planet, not simply in order to sustain life, but to enable people everywhere to experience God's beauty and wonder and majesty in the world that God has created. Amen. I think it's time, Connie.